Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Woodburn is proud to be hosting its first webinar series in 2019 on the complexities of finding and employing individuals in China. Are you planning to recruit your team in China? Are you having turnover of key employees in your organization? Together with Steinkellner China Search, a professional recruitment firm, both Woodburn and Steinkellner will provide you with information and tools on the HR issues which truly impact organizations that are not only new to the market, but that have been running for quite some time. Before we start today's presentation with Manfred, I would just like to go through a couple of slides of administration. The use of a VPN may be required by people based in mainland China. As we all know, there is such a thing as the Great Firewall. I'm also currently using a VPN. As such, it could very well be that there are sections of instability on the internet line. Please don't exit the webinar. We will return within 30 seconds to 1 minute to continue the presentation. Once you've launched into the session, you will be prompted to set up your audio. You will have a choice of choosing your computer audio system or also then going on to a landline. This is what pops up if you do choose, if you do click on the audio section in the control panel. By default, it will be on mic and speakers, but if you do want to switch to a landline, then there will be a number to dial, access code, as well as an audio pin. Please don't be shy. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation today. As is what happened yesterday, we did not get to all questions that were asked, so we will get to them. We promise you. We'll send you emails answering your questions. Please have patience with us because Manfred and I are dealing with the technicalities of GoToWebinar and getting the recording also up onto the YouTube page. Please be patient. We will get to you latest by the end of this week. The webinar today is being recorded. It will be posted on Woodburn's YouTube channel, and the PowerPoint presentation will also be distributed to everybody. So once again, please don't be shy. Ask your questions, ask your comments, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Just a technicality side to test the system. If people would be so kind as clicking on the hand button within their control panel, if you see the hand button, that will allow me to know that you are listening in and that you can actually hear me. If you could re-click that button, your hand will then disappear, and that will allow me to know that you're still listening. So let's begin today's session. I will first lead off. I am the moderator for today's session. Manfred is going to be speaking and presenting today. Allow me to introduce Woodburn for those of you that were not able to attend yesterday's webinar or any of our previous webinar series. Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is specialized in inbound investment into China and Hong Kong. We establish, manage, and administer companies in both jurisdictions to meet our clients' specific requirements, which can include anything from market entry, cross-border investment, tax optimization, and corporate restructuring. Our clients are all international and focused on an expansion into Asia, specifically into Hong Kong and China. The strategy of our clients is all different, but we have clients ranging from those that are manufacturing in China, exporting from China, selling into China, as well as offering a variety of services from healthcare to insurance to clean tech locally within the Chinese market. And they all range from startup organizations to multinationals as well as publicly listed companies. Just a little bit about myself. There is an error on this slide. I'm not the speaker for today. I'm just the moderator. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I've been dealing with the Chinese market specifically for the last 16 years in terms of helping all foreign invested companies establish solid, stable entities in the market. Versus me explaining what I've done and who I've worked with, I would rather kind of give you an idea of what I've learned in the Chinese market over the last 16 years. there are three things that are on the top of my list. I can go on for hours in terms of what else I've learned, but the main three things that I think are important for companies that are looking to invest into China or already in the Chinese market is one, be patient. As part of the Chinese culture, the Chinese know how to play off on the lack of patience that Westerners have. So what you need to really do to succeed in the Chinese market is be patient and understand that there is always solutions to any problem that arises. The second thing I've learned, and obviously it pertains to my industry and my sector, which is really in the accounting and tax side of things, is an eye on detail. I read things at least 2 to 3 times before I sign off on anything. I make sure that any contract or any document that I obtain is at least in English and Chinese. There is nothing that I don't know about running my own organization or helping to supervise my client's organization that I'm not aware of. It's important to make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into, and don't be lazy and say, well, it was given to me in Chinese, so I just ignored it. You can always translate it, okay? And you should have it always translated. But more than that, you should be specific on all the clauses and articles that you're reading within the documents that you're signing, and be aware of what's actually going on internally within your organization. The third thing that I've learned in China is that no company in China has had smooth sailing. Everybody has incurred some form of obstacle along their China journey. And one of the other aspects and traits of Western people is that they tend to always try and find the person to blame versus trying, first of all, to find the solution around the problem or the obstacle. And when you are working in such a fast-paced environment like China, it's important to go straight ahead to finding the solution, overcoming the obstacle in order to proceed with your journey. Once things are more settled, then you can find the person to blame and decide at that point whether you want to terminate the relationship or understand what's gone wrong. But people tend to always focus on things like, let's blame someone and spend time on that. You should really focus on how to make sure that your company doesn't lose momentum when they're going into the Chinese market. So my whole purpose with these webinar series is really to inspire, inform, and educate everyone that joins in on how to do business in China successfully, and also then giving tips and advice. And I'm very proud to have Manfred Steinkellner from Steinkellner China Search, who's going to be talking about how to build a successful sales organization in China. Manfred?
Yes. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Christina, for your introduction as well as for having me. Just a few words to myself as well as what my company does before we then kick off into the content. Similar to Christina, I've been active in China since 2003, and it's been quite a journey since then. At the end of the day, the great thing about China is it's just people. So once you kind of get over the cultural and the language barrier, you find that even the €100 million projects, you can quite easily and quite simply, just talk it over with them and say, look, how are we going to solve this? Apart from that, I run one of the leading executive search companies within Austria, Germany, and Switzerland that is focused on China. And what really, what makes me passionate, or what I'm passionate about, is simply to deliver opportunities to people and to find the right jobs for the right people at the right point of time. Christine, next, please. So just shortly about Steinkellner China Search. What we're good at is to identify and attract the right leaders for an organization in China fast. And we do that with very high precision because obviously if you're already going external, you'd like to find the people that you really need and not just some people. In doing so, we really focus on sales and on production, because at the end of the day, no matter what industry, no matter what you're doing, you got to have a solid product and you need to produce that somewhere. And you got to have a very good sales organization in order to sell it to your clients. In terms of our clients, some of them, they're comparatively small. They're trying to enter China. They're trying to set up WOFE, wholly foreign owned enterprise, or they're setting up joint ventures. And some of them, they've got a couple of factories or more than 10 factories in China and have been there for the last 20 or 30 years. And one of our business units is also dealing with operational roles, because especially if we're talking about setting up a sales organization in China, what you really need, apart from the sales GM, then when you want to grow a little bit, is you need a couple of very efficient and very good salespeople. Next. All right, and this brings us to today's webinar, is how to build a successful sales organization in China. Next, Christina. What happens sometimes really is when you're Europe-based and when you think about China, you read certain things in the newspaper, and it's all a bit foggy. You see certain things, you see that Chinese growth is slowing down for a couple of years now, it's not double-digit anymore, and this all, raises question marks in your head on how to move ahead, how to do things, how to actually implement your sales organization. Next, please, Christina. So one of the very simple goals for today's session really is to increase your clarity a little bit. Obviously, 45 minutes is not very much, so my apologies up front that we're not going to be covering all aspects that you actually need to set up a fully functional sales organization there, but we'll touch on two key subjects. Christina? So the way I've structured this, I've picked two scenarios. One scenario really is I've got no sales activities going on for China at the moment. This is what I call fresh start in China. Christina, click please. And the second scenario I'd like to look at with you is you already in China, you already have a sales organization in China, but in all fairness, it is not working the way you would like it to, or business requires it to, or even the on-site general manager would want it to work. And so we'll look at what we can do in order to actually make that work. Christina? So, just imagine for those of you, let's start with scenario one, for those of you who are not in China yet, something that is very, very, very realistic is that if you manage to be successful in China, it becomes one of your strategic markets. The answer is very simple, really. It is the single largest market on earth. So if you have a product that you can actually sell there, and if you have a product that is actually needed there, then why should it not have a revenue share of 30%, which in this first example would account to 3 million euros if your global revenue is 10 million. And what happens quite often as well is that if you sell something in China, the profit margin is higher. So that means your global profit share of the Chinese market share is going to be higher than the revenue share. And here I've put down 40%. Christina, if maybe you are a little bit bigger organization, then it also is quite simple. It just means maybe out of a 50 million global revenue, we're talking 10 million is coming in from China. So just when you look at those numbers, you already see why so many people are drawn to China, and why it simply pays off to spend a couple of minutes, or like today, a short webinar on figuring out how to get going and how to actually make it happen. Christina? So where do you start next? You might have a headquarter-only organization with no sales activities in China at all, meaning you're headquartered in England, you're headquartered in London, you're headquartered somewhere in Belgium, like this, like that, but no sales going on in China. Maybe this is your scenario. Next, Christina. Or you might have a headquarter-based role that is actually already doing sales in China. It could be a regional sales rep, could be a business development person. That person is, on a certain interval flying in and out in China and going to visit key accounts and maybe going to visit distributors in order to ensure that business is going as planned. Next. Or what also could be the case is that you actually currently do maintain a sourcing office in China, but you've got no sales activities going on. So this could be, three different scenarios on where you're actually starting off. I'll be touching a little bit on the challenges and also on, very straightforward ways that you can use in order to then start implementing your sales. Next, please. The thing really is, if you're not in China yet, the task always looks a little bit daunting. You know, where do we start? Do we need to set up a new company? Is it going to be 100% owned by the parent? Should we do a joint venture? What about the timeline? What about the budget? How much would we actually be paying for things? There's many things to ask. One tip up front here, you know, don't make your life more complex than needed. Just go and ask around, see if within your network you've got a couple of people who've been there, who've done that, or who are kind of involved in China operations. Invite them for lunch, invite them for dinner, invite them for a cup of tea or coffee, and, you know, simply ask them a couple of questions. There simply are no dumb questions. With this approach, you'll always, you know, get a little bit of clarity as early as possible, and then you can see how you structure the project and how you make it happen. Just one thing at this point here before I actually forget it, in case some of you out there do really want to set up their own company, I strongly suggest talking with Christina. 2 reasons. Apart from the fact that she really is competent and knows what she's doing, in terms of company setup, she is also very competitive. So just a ping for those of you out there, if this is on your to-do list, then you know, just approach her, send her an email, or let her know that she should approach you. That can't be a bad idea. Next, please, Christina. So let's see in these different scenarios how we can actually move forward. Next. For example, this one scenario, headquarter only, no sales activities for China at all. What we had here was a very small client, but he was venture capital backed. In addition to that, there was a very big need to actually be in the market very quickly. So what they chose to do is simply, because of the time constraints that they had to enter the Chinese market, because they already had identified the Chinese market as a global strategic market, and because they simply wanted to move ahead and had to move ahead, we headhunted the GM as well as the key team members from the technical perspective in order to get them going and get them on the ground. This is when you're going for speed and you're not there, then I think chances are very high that you need to go external, unless you're already knowing the kind of top man and he's so well connected that he can bring in the whole team right away. Next, please, Christina. In the second scenario, which I think is a bit more common, that you have SMEs with maybe a couple of 100 people or smaller than that, but that you already are trying business development wise to go into the market and to do this or that, but you don't have, you know, loads of resources. You're not venture capital backed. You don't want to or don't need to be as fast as possible, but it needs to work. It needs to work organically, so to speak. So what they chose to do is simply to go ahead and say, look, this person who's been headquarter based and who was Chinese, she's actually on parent leave, on pregnancy leave, and she's not coming back for the next couple of years. So what they did is they kind of evaluated a little bit the performance of that role and figured, well, you know, performance is not really how it should be. Meanwhile, they kind of were acquired by another company, and with that other company, they already had kind of a structure in China where they could tie their new sales role in. So what we did there is simply to move along and find a person who can do sales, you know, on the ground. You can also do that with an employment solution, meaning you don't need to have your own company there. You can use an intermediary company to hire that person. You just need to, you know, really consider and make sure with this one option. If you're not starting with a team, if you're just starting with one person who's going to be running for you, you know, you should really be looking very close at the character, because that person has got kind of no other team members to bond to. So you just need to think about, you know, how do we keep him or her happy? How do we keep them going? How will the onboarding process look like? Because what you really don't want in this stage of going into the Chinese sales market is to actually lose that person after 3 months because they say, look, you know, it's a little bit hard to sell your products here. And apart from that, you've got, you know, I've got nobody to talk about this kind of thing with. So this is something that you need to pay attention to a little bit if you're trying to move in this direction and go in this way. Next, please, Christina. If you already have an entity over there that's doing anything else apart from sales, and you kind of just want to hire a salesperson, you know, then I think that is a bit easier. In this case, we had a client, a German automotive industry with a sourcing office in Ningbo, and there what we did really was to, they said, look, you know, now is really time to use our 3D printing technology and push into the Chinese market and sell there. So within that team, you know, they were looking if they had somebody to take, then they were doing it alone. They put up job ads and then they recruited somebody, and that just didn't work out at all. And then because they've known me for a while, they approached me and said, look, we need to find a sales guy here. You know, it's, again, no matter whether you're going external or whether you're going internal, when you start something up, you just really need to make sure that you kind of find an icebreaker mentality. You know, it's very different having an established sales organization with 50 million revenue and everything's there and everything's in place and you've got support for everything and you've got material for everything, or if you start new. If you start new, it's very different people, and I personally believe that it's crucial to kind of find the right sales personality for this kind of job. I personally do not believe that in this kind of situation that it makes a lot of sense to say, well, you know, we're going to take somebody with no sales experience because, you know, headquarter most of the time is willing to let you try once or at best 2 times, but then afterwards support from headquarter will waver. So you'll need to make sure in your head that you kind of, you know, choose a scenario that the chances of success are quite high because you don't have an unlimited amount of numbers where you can try again. Next slide, please, Christina. So how do you find Mr. or Mrs. Right? You know, it's very different. There's numerous ways, there's numerous channels, and there's no one that is right or no recipe that kind of works for all. What I always suggest is, you know, go ask your existing business partners, ask around. If you're already kind of flying back and forth with China, or if you already have friends doing this, it doesn't cost you anything. Many people tend to kind of, you know, be supportive for those kind of things, and it's a favor on their side, and you'll pay that favor back when the time comes. Fairs can be something that's interesting to kind of start kick off with. You don't even need to go to China fairs these days. If we're talking, let's say, technology, there's so many Chinese at fairs in Central Europe or Western Europe or wherever. So, you know, just go to fairs, just talk to people and see. The only thing I want to point out here, what I do not suggest is to meet somebody first sight, then sign a deal and then hire him kind of on a fixed base fee for 1 year. What I'm really saying, and there Christina and me have got a similar approach, is you need to get to know the people, you know, see what kind of people they are and see really if they also have interest 3 months later, 6 months later. You know, you need to build up that relationship first to see if he or she is actually the right one. There's many SMEs, and I've also, when I started off with China in my early days, I worked for one SME that simply, you know, a Chinese guy visited and said, look, you know, geothermal energy is big in China, let's do something. And they said, well, perfect, let's do it. And this is how he became the general manager for the entity in China. Then later, 5 years later, that this entity failed came as no surprise because he didn't have the competencies, he didn't have the capacity to build the bridge and so on and so forth. So really, you know, make sure that you find the right person when you start off. You can also use a lot of digital channels. Chinese use WeChat. You can use things like LinkedIn. You can use Chaopin. You know, there's a lot of platforms out there. Next, please, Christina. Doing it alone or getting support is always a big question, and obviously nobody wants to, you know, spend extra money on hiring people. I think if you want to draw a black and white picture, there's 2 ways. Either you say, look, we only start when we have the right person. With that approach, normally what it means, it takes time. If you have that time, if your owner is thinking this way, if your top management is thinking this way, then most likely you'll have to go this way anyway. Going the other way around, which some organizations do, and say, look, where do we have growth markets globally? Where do we have strategic markets? Then depending on your product, normally China lights up very early these days. Yeah? And so then, it becomes kind of a question of what's your strategy and also what are your time constraints. If it is a strategic market and if other competitors are moving in there, I personally don't think that it makes sense to wait another 3 years. Yeah? So this is really kind of the spectrum that you need to decide with. Christina? So let's say you sign a deal with us. Let's say 4 weeks after you sign the deal, you got 6 great candidates in your inbox. Then you either meet them in person or you do video interviews, or you first video interview them, then you meet them in person. I always strongly suggest to actually meet them in person, and maybe not just one time, maybe a couple of times. And so, sooner or later, a couple of the candidates drop out. You've got 2 candidates left. How do you actually figure who is the right person? Let's move to the next slide, Christina. If we're talking a sales general manager, so we're talking the top man of a sales organization in China. And if we're talking about building up a new sales organization, I think at the end of the day, it's quite easy. If you want to have a high certainty of success, I would strongly suggest to pick somebody with sales management experience. It's different if you've done sales yourself or if you actually need to manage a team of, let's say, 3 people or 5 people or 10 people, or later on then maybe 20 or 30 people. It's just different. The second thing is, as you also see in my logo, is a bridge. Somebody needs to be bridging the gap. That is a very, very, very crucial component, and it becomes quite simple and obvious if you get on an airplane, fly to China, not be in Shanghai, but be a little bit outside Shanghai for a day, and try to cover all the things you need covering for yourself. You can't. Why? Because of language. And in combination with language is culture. There's a couple of 1,000 kilometers difference between Europe and China. And that, geographical difference that needs to be bridged. So this is why, in this case, when you start up, I strongly suggest to have, somebody with experience with a European company. Now, some of you will ask, yeah, but are we talking then about a UK guy who's obviously already having experience with a UK company, or are we talking about a Chinese guy? My personal understanding and experience is that when we're talking sales organizations, sales is a process that needs to be very subtle normally to work out well. So what happens very often in 9 out of 10 cases in sales general manager roles, we actually put in Chinese people because they know the market, they know what's going on. And this is what you need in order to have a successful sales organization. If you send somebody from the UK to China who's never been to China, who doesn't know how things work there, then I'd give it a much lower success rate. If we go to bottom left, build-up experience, again, is a different thing if you are steering an oil tanker, if you're running a sales organization with $100 million revenue per year, and then you need to increase, or if you actually need to build up. I always say going from 0 to 1 is an infinite increase. And this infinite increase means you need to have certain people who can actually handle that. Not everybody can. So you really need to be looking for, this build-up experience. And another critical point, obviously, with that one is a proven track record. If you want to have a high level of certainty, then I strongly suggest you hire somebody who's done it. If you say, well, look, it needs to be cheap, then obviously you can hire somebody who's got 1 or 2 years of sales experience. But then you just need to understand that you're going very different speeds. Yeah, it most likely the organization will develop differently as if you had put in somebody who has already had that experience and build up the sales organization. Next, please. Especially on the top left, you need to be careful because there's a couple of differences in China that you wouldn't see and wouldn't have here in Europe. 2 things. On one thing is Chinese normally tend to be very, very flexible in terms of location. Shanghai, no problem. Beijing, no problem. Shenyang, no problem. Chongqing, Chengdu, no problem. Although it's changing, a lot of people in the interview process will let you know, no problem. Now you need to understand a little bit their situation. When they, for example, just lost their job, obviously they're looking for opportunities, and when they get a good one, they'll take it. But if, let's say, the kids are 3 years old, and let's say they have 2 kids, and they're 3 years old, and they're living in Beijing, and their job is in Shanghai, then I bet you they are going to be looking for jobs in Beijing, or they're going to be looking for a way within your company to actually then establish a branch office in Beijing, something like this. So this is one thing you really should be careful with in the interview process, and also ask about it, and the Chinese also won't find it weird. And the other thing is also to understand a little bit, how about parents and who's actually caring for them? The older Chinese still have normally this kind of thinking that they'll be looking after their parents. And when they get older and when they need more caring, and if the distance between job and where the parents live is actually too big, you might also run into fluctuation issues. Next, Christina. So one thing then, the obvious thing is the competence side. For every job, as well as for every kind of project that needs to be done, you can think about what would be good, what should that person possess in terms of competence. And always, make a distinction between, does he have the potential to, or has he already proven to do that? And especially in China, and especially with sales, you've got to be very, very, very careful with the proving. Very careful. Next, culture fit. I think it's quite obvious, somebody who's been working in a 40,000 people organization might find it a bit tricky to see and accept how a 50 people organization works. But also apart from size and from processes, its company cultures are very different. Do pay attention to that. Next. And another obvious one, salary. What is your range? That is something that you really need to be paying attention to. But apart from that, is what motivates him or her. Next. So just to give you kind of a rough number, very broad, very unspecified. If we're talking ranges for a sales general manager, we're talking anywhere between 800,000 RMB to 1.5 million RMB. So approximately 100,000 euros to 200,000 euros. This will depend a lot on experience, on location, on how attractive is the job, and many more things. And if I say these numbers, then I'm talking about experienced GMs who know what they need to do. If you take somebody who doesn't have that experience and give him the title of GM, then obviously the numbers will drop. The numbers will drop a lot. Next. When it comes to choosing, when you have those 2 final candidates, what always helps me is simply to look at the key objectives for the next 3 years. So, for example, you'd want to establish a sales organization in China, and with that sales organization in China, with the next 3 years, you'll ramp it up to a couple of 100K revenue, depending on what your product is. Could be also a couple of million, depending on what your business model and your product or your service is. And with that one, that is a very good filter for understanding, does he fit or does he not fit? Always have the tasks in mind, and also understand, if you're looking for somebody who will be staying with you for 15 years, that might not be a very objective criteria. I get clients who do that, who want that, who try to do this, typically the family-owned SMEs. Let's talk 5 to 10 years, that is already far way out. But really what you need to be making sure of that works now is the first 3 years. All right, next. Just one slide, because obviously you'll need to have that as well in order to build up a sales organization, is operational salespeople. As you've seen in the scenarios before, you can also start just with operational salespeople. If that is the approach that you choose, and if you think that makes more sense for you, or if that is what your constraints allow, I think obviously you need to have somebody from the industry. you need to get somebody from industry with that industry background that you're in. Contacts in China called guanxi is very, very, very important. Cold calling does not make sense. You really need to be if you find the right person, really do pay attention that they have the contacts that matter to you, that they can call them up and say, look, now I'm working for this company, let's get together for dinner and let's talk about the products. This is what you want to be aiming at. And then when it comes to salary range for these people, we're talking really anything between 10 to 30,000 RMB per month. I had sales roles that overall actually cost 500,000 RMB, which is already on a very, very expensive side. And then it can also be much cheaper than that. But again, my thinking really is cost effective first and price down. If somebody's expensive but he's bringing in 3 times the money, from my perspective, this is much more desirable than somebody who's cheap but who's just incurring costs because he's not selling anything. In terms of variable components for those roles can go up to 50%, and they should be at least 20%. Next, Christina. Okay, now we come to the second scenario. You've got a sales operation in China, but that sales operation is not working. Either you never got it off the ground, or you got it off the ground and then there's more competition, or the sales GM that you have in place is actually, he got a little bit lazy, or he doesn't want to do the hard work anymore, or something on the market changed and one market segment actually got much stronger competition and you didn't manage to adapt your products. There's many different reasons that can lead to a sales operation not working in China. But let's try and look at this scenario a little bit closer before we can go into Q&A. Next, Christina. So just 2 cases here. You've got stagnating revenues and no growth in one key market, i.e. automotive market, with a product-based business model. Next. And the second one, in a project-based business model where you're selling projects at least the size of double-digit million euros. For 2 to 3 years, you've got no new projects that have been sold. Next. So if you have that, you have an existing sales company. Within the last couple of years, you notice growing competition. Revenues have been stagnating. Not all your colleagues or not all the key decision makers are willing to accept that things are not going as planned in China. Sometimes the people who would need to accept might have been the people who actually brought in the previous sales GM. Sometimes your headquarter may not have been as supportive as it would have been needed to in order to lift the organization off the ground. So this is a very, very tricky thing where I think more than in other situations, very often it will simply take time and this hard look in the mirror and hard look at the numbers that say, look, this is not going the way it should be going. And yeah, many people might not be inclined to actually support the changes needed. But sooner or later, depending on how your organization thinks, sooner or later, people will see and need to accept that, well, our competitors have been growing at 20, 30%, and we've just been stagnating. So they should really need to be sooner or later kind of warming up to your idea of delivering a change. Next, please, Christina. How to proceed, really, I think here is very simple. Either you already know the successor, you've met him, or you think that you can take somebody out of the team and then promote him, and then play it this way, or you know somebody from a competitor who can do exactly that and who's very good at doing that and who's interested in it, or you get external support to recruit the successor. Because very simple, just picture let's say a 20 people sales organization or a 50 people sales organization in China, and then picture you tell the HR lady that she needs to hire a new boss. It just doesn't work that way. You don't tell the employee to hire a new boss. So you've got these 2 options, go around, ask around, or as I said, even better, you already know somebody who will be the successor, or you'll need to wreak in external support. Next, Christina. So again, you had we supported you 4 weeks later. You get 6 great candidates. You talked with them. You did a couple of rounds. 2 top candidates are left. Let's take a closer look. Next, Christina. The first one is John. John is 45. He builds sustainable organizations. His growth is profit-based. He's got a low fluctuation on people assets. He's very good with people. He's managing them quite well. He implements processes, design reviews, handover processes. He knows and solves challenges of European companies in China. His network is on a senior level. He builds real teams and utilizes them properly. However, he's also, he will be asking for resources to build up a local organization. He'll also ask for a home office in Beijing. This is touching upon the point that we had earlier on. The location we're recruiting here for is Shanghai, but this person, John, he is from Beijing, and his children are fairly young, and his wife, they're all living in Beijing. So, simply from a very personal thing, he'll want to install a branch office in Beijing. And he's not really that cheap. It costs 1.5 million RMB, which the people at the client were not very much enthused when they heard the costs of John. Next, Christina. Now we're talking about Alex, second top candidate. He's smart, he's 36, he's young, he's focused, he's very considerate in his approach. My client has been very impressed with his sales hit rate. So he had 10 selected opportunities, and he closed 5 of them within the last 2.5 years. And this is now B2B sales process with a sales cycle of 1 year, and with project volumes anywhere between, let's say, 10 to 100 million euros. Yeah? So just for you to kind of give a picture. He'll use headquarter for design and sales process. He can bridge the gap, but not quite in a way that James would be able to do it. His network in the industry is rather limited. He's compliant. Whatever you do, whenever you build up a sales organization, please do make sure that these people, at least from their thinking and from their doing, are actually focused on compliance, because it's becoming more and more important. And you really don't want to have a black hole in your China organization a couple of years down the line. What is important for Alex here really is with his 36, he's quite hungry for success and status. And status, as many of you I think might be aware, in China is much, much more important than it actually is in Europe. Yeah. Not to say that status is not important in Europe, it's just in China, from my personal experience, it's much more important. And we expect a further job change from him. I would not see him staying at the same company for the next 15 years. I also wouldn't see him staying for 10 years. So this is a clear distinction between Alex and James. When you go to the right side, he currently only has 2 direct reports. So in terms of, running teams, building teams, he's much more inexperienced, but he's cheaper. He costs, so to speak, only 1 million RMB. Yeah. And those are the 2. Christina, next, please. So when we go back now to the 4 quadrants and trying to understand kind of where he fits in terms of personal life, James, he's much more settled, so you'll get more stability. With Alex, you'll need to really trigger him in terms of success and status, which currently he's pretty much taken from sales success. Next, please, Christina. In terms of competence, Alex, the younger one, he's much more competent and very good in actually doing sales, whereas the older one, James, he's much more experienced in sales management. Alex hasn't been a GM yet, and John actually already has been. Next, Christina. In terms of culture fit, both fit in quite well because they're coming from similar background companies. Next. In terms of salary, that really will then depend on, does he fit in or does he not fit in? You maybe need to single out one of those 2 because he's just too expensive for the budget that you have planned. Next. So just for example, if you need to kind of revamp your China organization, just to give you a rough timeline, if we're talking about something like this, we started in October. Client had quality profiles in November. First round interview was done in December, second round in January. Fly in means that the candidates were flown to Europe to meet the top management, and contract signed in February, and first day on the job is going to be in April. So this is kind of like, you know, just to give you an idea and exemplary timeline of how something like this could look like. All right. So just, you know, to jump to sum this up really, I think if no matter whether you start fresh or whether you want to restart an existing organizations, we need to be having clear and realistic goals for the next 3 to 5 years, and you need to act on them. And you need this energy from your team to work towards those goals. You need a very clear strategy and the discipline to implement it. I see a lot of organizations having good strategies, but then when it comes to discipline to implement it, it's a different game. Point 3, somebody really needs to build the bridge. If you have people not building the bridge, I haven't seen any case where this worked well. You need to be building the bridge. Either you have the person who is in the driver's seat in China doing that, the general manager, or you have the person responsible for the Chinese market doing that. But somebody needs to be bridging the gap, because there definitely is one. I personally think it's a good idea, depending on the organization's size, to make one person in HQ the main responsible for the Chinese market. And then you also need to give him or her the support that they need. And that person also needs to build up a relationship with the general manager. And this then in turn also solves your topics of fluctuation, because if the Chinese general manager is feeling that he's, you know, appreciated, respected, and so on and so forth, then the chances that he's dropping out soon they're going down. They're definitely going down. The other thing is, you know, if you start, just make sure you're committed. If you're just fooling around in China and trying a little bit but not really committing, then that normally doesn't. You know, there's no advantage for you. Yeah, okay, you've tried it, you've failed. So, you know, make your homework, understand what it takes, take the time to understand what it takes, and then when you've got all those things together, see if you can actually, you know, handle this commitment. Yeah? And then find a way to handle it and commit it. And if your sales organization in China isn't producing results, you should really act now. And I'd like to close, you know, the conclusions with a statement from Warren Buffett, where he really says, no matter how great the talents or efforts, some things just take time. You can't produce a baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant. Thank you so much. I think Christina, we'll launch into the Q&A. Is that all right?
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Manfred. So I actually have a question for you that's popped up throughout your presentation, which is something I think we've both experienced over time. Is, you know, how do you deal with clients who keep changing their mind about the job responsibilities or the job criteria or the job requirements? How do you deal with this type of uncertainty when you're handling a search project?
I mean, I think one thing we just need to understand is that ideally, not every day you go and look for a new China general manager or a new plant manager or whatnot. So I think you need to give people a little bit of credit and understand that you know, they'll need to look at a couple of people and get to know a couple of people until they find out what they themselves really try to go for. So partially we try to incorporate that and essentially just try to be very fast in understanding what they want and very fast in giving them the first candidates and meeting up with these people as soon as possible, so that they also get a better feeling of what they actually want. Because I think sometimes it's just really hard to articulate and to write down in an email and say, look, I'm looking for this. You'll know if he or she is Mrs. Right, if he or she is in front of you. And so this is how we partially do it. And yeah, I mean, obviously there's also more challenging projects when clients kind of get this understanding of who is Mr. or Mrs. Right very late in the process, and then you try the best you can not to change the overall timeline too much. And most of the time it simply means, you know, put in extra hours on our side, and then kind of mobilize new candidates and make sure that the client's timelines are met.
And the next question is coming from Bill, who's asking the following. They're planning on entering the Chinese market, and they're asking, what do the candidates need to possess in order to make sure that the company is successful in China?
I mean, again, you know, for me, it's always very much dependent on the scenario. But let's say you're building up you're building up a small team with at least maybe 1 or 2 sales guys, and here we're talking about a sales general manager. Then ideally, again, I think it's very helpful if this person has already been working with European companies. People who haven't, you need to teach them. You need to teach them how essentially all those cultural differences, and this is quite, as you would say it in Chinese, is quite mafan, because for many of the things you don't have a feel yourself. Second, again, sales management experience coming from your industry. You know, have somebody who knows what he's doing in your industry, and ideally with your product. And I think then you're very well set. And then what you need to do is you need to make sure that this person gets support. Sometimes with European companies, or what Western companies forget is, you know, is onboarding. You really need to make sure in the first 6, 12, 24 months that this person gets to know the right people, is supportive, and also that you actually listen to them. Normally going into a new market also means that headquarter is learning something new. So also, you know, keep your ears open to see what is he saying. And not everything that they say, you know, needs to be exactly the way it is, but you need to, you touched upon this yesterday, Christina, you need to be open to learn. Don't say, I don't know nothing about the Chinese market. Start learning as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. The next question I find actually extremely interesting. When you're going through an interview process, obviously both sides should be selling themselves. One side is the company and the other side is the candidate. How would a Western firm, or how can a Western firm prove that the sales guy is telling the truth, that the numbers he's saying is correct, that he's not overselling himself?
That's a very good one. Look, I think there's 2 components to this one. The first one is you know, ask for referrals. If this person, let's say, is 40 to 50, then he's been in a couple of stages, and there's a couple of people he can speak to. Obviously, also these people, if he's overselling, they will be overselling, but you'll kind of still get a better feeling. So ask for 2 to 3 referrals. That's one thing. The other thing is, sales at the end of the day is always quite easy. You've got something, it needs to be sold, full stop. You've got a yearly sales quota. So, you know, don't let them get off with, you know, I've overperformed 120%. Let them tell it, and then you go back and then you revisit, and then you go, okay, in this role, you stayed 3 years. Sales quota, year number 1, how much did you achieve? Sales quota, year number 2, how much did you achieve? And then the way they answer, the way it's different, the way there's hesitation, you see or feel or hear, oops, there is something. And then you go deep dive there and try and understand, you know, how. Not meeting the quota, I mean, you know, sometimes maybe the quota was unrealistic. Sometimes maybe, as in 2008, 2009, you had very good reasons for not meeting the quota. So I think, you know, just in general, try to come from a perspective of trying to understand the other person. And then when you see, well, you know, he's been not telling me the truth for half the things he said, you can ask yourself, do I really want to work with him? or in other cases, maybe he's been, a little bit overselling in one small detail. And then this gives you a feeling, and also your peers, on whether you'd like to choose him or not.
Well, I think one thing that you highlighted during your presentation, Manfred, is the recruitment timeline, where you actually said, you should do numerous interviews with the same person. So you can also kind of, I don't want to use the word trick, but you can also ask the same questions throughout the follow-up interviews to see if the information provided also matches, right? Especially
Absolutely.
in terms of the sales quotas and whatnot. I think, with every resume, I don't want to even just say it's with Chinese people, but I think anywhere in the world, you always have to take it with a grain of salt. In any case.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
People are always trying to oversell themselves if they're looking for a job. So, be wary that it just doesn't just happen in China, it happens everywhere.
And I mean, also, sorry, Christina, just to kind of add here shortly. Also, what I've seen a lot, especially with the operational salespeople, with those who are not running the show, not leading the team, what I find quite often is, sometimes in English they come across as not competent enough, just because their spoken English isn't good. Very often then when I switch to Chinese, actually you notice that, wow, they are really good. So also, just for those out there listening, try and pay attention to this, because at the end of the day, obviously you will want to have good communication with them, but the key function of an operational salesperson is still to do sales and to meet the quota, and not to keep top management in conversations all day long.
So leading off of that, Manfred, there is a question that came in regarding language capabilities. When you're looking, it's clear from your presentation, when you're looking for a sales manager or someone in a senior management role, English is a criteria. So you should really only be speaking to candidates whose English is fluent. And there are plenty out there on the market who do speak fluent English. But in terms of the sales operational guys, because you just highlighted, once you switch to Chinese, the communication level gets better. How do companies based overseas manage that language barrier if they're doing the recruitment themselves?
It's a tricky one. I mean, obviously, if you have Chinese employees within your company, then this could be partially how you actually manage that. If you're, so to speak, just an English organization with English speakers only, or a German organization with English and German speakers only, then I think you will simply have to accept the fact that you can't.
But just as a selling point for Manfred, this is probably why you would want to talk or work with an external provider who has that capability and can actually do those testings. Like you said, Manfred, you can do the interview in both languages, in English as well as in Chinese, to get really at the heart of the candidate and see if they can reach the objective goals, the goals of the client, right?
Because obviously also one thing that always works, and I think that's for all of us here, if you speak in your mother tongue, you're probably a little bit less nervous. If you need to be speaking in a language that you don't fully, command, then it's a bit tricky out there, but that's just obvious.
Let's lead on to the last two questions for today.
Okay.
One of the questions that I had that's popped up has been, how can companies benchmark salaries? I mean, if they have to create a budget, how do they start doing that? I mean, besides talking to external providers, are there other avenues where they can kind of do a benchmark based on their industry, sector, role?
I think, again, I'd really, for those, because the benchmarks that are out there, I mean, obviously everybody can Google, right? Or Baidu, if you want to use the Chinese version. It's just always the problem is, if for one role the benchmark is going to be 10,000 RMB to 30,000 RMB, is really a bit tricky to put together a budget that should stick. So again, I would really suggest, reach out to friends, reach out to business partners and say, look, what's realistic? Reach out to, you know, people like Christina, because obviously she's you know, kind of also doing the numbers for organizations. Also reach out to organizations who recruit, who benchmark, and then probably who could be a good help for kind of getting a first idea, is also the various chambers of commerce of the different countries. They can kind of be a good first start. Or if you have any kind of let's say a representative of Chinese business parks in your area, that could be a first thing. But really, you know, there's a huge difference between a sales role and a sales role. You need, as in Europe as well, you know, you need to be talking specifics and be precise to then also actually get numbers that stick.
I also just want to pinpoint something here, because I've experienced this myself, recruiting my own teams. You also have to be a little bit flexible. So what you might have set out as a budget on the initial start of recruiting somebody, the minute you start interviewing people and you hear what their current salary levels are or compensation levels are and what they're expected are to be, you should, you know, adapt your budget. Because when you interview people, you find out what they're capable of. You might then also change what you're looking for to maybe somebody with a higher role or somebody who's less qualified. You have to be in a position where you can also be a little bit flexible in the budget aspect, especially right now because salary levels are going up in China, and you know, a little bit of flexibility helps everyone. Right. So the last question that's come up, Manfred, has been about commission payments, especially regarding salespeople, where maybe you'll be providing only commissions, or you'll have a fixed cost plus a variable cost. Could you provide some examples or some case studies on how these salary packages have been formulated when there is a commission or variable component?
I mean, to start off with, what I hear every now and then, but what I don't see working very well is, you know, have salespeople who are on commission only. That might have been an option in the past because China is very much guanxi based, very much connection based. But if we're talking B2B sales processes, in most of the time, I personally find it isn't effective enough. Obviously, it's always a special situation. What you want to make sure kind of is that you have a standard, at least within your Chinese organization, that you're kind of sticking to. You know, if you have one person with 50% variable and the other person with no variable, that I don't find is very advantageous for yourself, because word will get out and then you will have a stink within your team. So at the end of the day, for example, this one role that we recruited for the sourcing office, what we did there, really, I think the overall budget, what he would cost per year, is a 300,000 RMB, because he's a graduate from a very prestigious and well-known university in China. That is okay for the location. That is south of Shanghai, Ningbo. And as far as I'm aware, the way they finally structured it is that 20% out of that is going to be a variable component. Now, and this is where maybe for those of you who are starting out, it kind of becomes important. It's not just variable or not, and how much variable or not. The question is, if you start off, how do you actually tie the variable? To which KPIs do you tie them? And what I see is not a good idea when you're starting out is from year number one to tie it to revenue. You might think about something like a ramp-up stage, where at the beginning, you know, part of this is going to be marketing-related KPIs. Part of this is simply, you know, kind of getting in touch with target customers. And then from year two, it becomes more and more focused on revenue. And then in year three, it kind of becomes focused on revenue only. So these are kind of models that we implement quite a lot, because again, it's unrealistic if you're doing something completely new, and then from day one, you're making big time revenue. All
right. Well, everyone, we will leave it there for today. we apologize. We're running 4 minutes over. Manfred, thank you very much for today's presentation, and we will see you tomorrow again for the presentation on how to hire the right plant manager to ensure a smooth production facility. For those of you that are still interested in registering for our 2 last webinars, they will be occurring tomorrow and on Thursday. So there's still time. Please do register for those. And again, if you have any questions that you want to direct at Manfred, you'll get a copy of the presentation with his email address on it as well. Manfred, again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for everybody else, we hopefully will see you on either Wednesday or Thursday, or hopefully both. See you all very soon. Thank you and goodbye.